Salvete, spectatores! Let me begin by thanking Professor James M. May for what I'm sure was a memorable and hyperbolic introduction. I am immensely grateful to Jim, my 40-year friend and colleague, for agreeing to serve as the MC for what was supposed to have been a very real banquet with very real food and drink in a very real place, Birmingham, Alabama, at the end of March. Like all of us, Jim got more than he bargained for this year. It is now the end of May, the month of May, I mean, not Jim May, and we have no banquet to enjoy, no physical locale to photograph, and no printed program to take notes in. But we do still have one another. We are still gathered together, albeit virtually, to continue the tradition of warm camaraderie that has kept CAMWS alive and well for 115 years. Thank you all for your loyalty to CAMWS, for your devotion to classical studies, and for your determination to persevere and not abandon hope, even in the face of a pandemic. You are brave, passionate souls, and I am honored to have had the opportunity to work with each and every one of you. This virtual meeting of CAMWS would not have been possible without the technological savvy and organizational skills of Emma Vanderpool and Amy Pistone. I continue to marvel at their ability to remain patient, calm, cheerful, and encouraging, no matter how many questions they are pelted with. We have also relied on the talents and goodwill of 27 volunteer tech assistants. Their enthusiasm has been contagious. In fact, the whole week has been filled with youthful exuberance, perhaps best on display in our first ever undergraduate poster session. What I have found most gratifying, however, is to observe the kind, sincere, and respectful collaboration of the young, the old, and the in-between. I have always loved the supportive, we're in this together feel at CAMWS meetings, and I hope you have all felt welcomed and in the company of friends this past week, despite the social awkwardness of the Zoom format. Special thanks are due to Professors Ward Briggs, David Schenker, Davina McLean, and Gareth Jacobson, who synced their voices so sweetly with the PowerPoints that were used in these closing ceremonies. The PowerPoints themselves were created by Davina and our incoming CAMWS administrative assistant, Drew Alvarez. I am grateful, too, for the introductory organ music played by Professor Robert Ullery, the vocal selections recorded by the 4 talented classics students from Samford University, and of course, the rhetorical magic performed by our CAMWS orator, David White. Congratulations to the winners of this year's Ovationes, and to all whose accomplishments and contributions to CAMWS have been celebrated today. And finally, in this extraordinary year, we owe the most extraordinary thanks of all to CAMWS Secretary-Treasurer Professor Thomas J. Sinkowitz and to CAMWS Administrative Assistant Jevany Gillen, who have sacrificed so much of their time, energy, and peace of mind over the past 8 years to make CAMWS an organization of which everyone can be proud. Although the pandemic did its darndest to defeat our dynamic duo, they both passed the test with flying colors. Now they have just one more month to survive, What could possibly go wrong in 4 weeks? Before passing their batons to Davina and Drew in Louisiana and being able to take a well-deserved rest. Please join me in giving Tom and Jevony a loud and appreciative round of applause in whatever way your technology allows. Back in January, in the days before COVID-19 had become a household name, I was teaching a course on ancient comedy. My students kept asking me why some of the characters in the plays by Menander, Plautus, and Terence had no names. It seemed to the class that a name was basic to one's identity. Had the ancient playwrights been so scatterbrained that they simply forgot to include a name for every character? Or had some of the names possibly fallen out of the manuscripts? After being asked the same thing multiple times, it became for me a very old question and a very tiresome one. But then I began to suspect that somebody was trying to tell me something. I eventually reached the conclusion that I was receiving a mysterious subliminal message from Thalia, the muse of comedy. As far as I could tell, she was directing me to use this presidential address as an opportunity to reflect on a very old question, namely this one. Why did the writers of New Comedy, by which I mean both Greek New Comedy and Roman comedy, choose sometimes to name and sometimes to leave unnamed? What were the considerations, linguistic, theatrical, cultural, that motivated their decisions? I will proceed straightforwardly by discussing Menander, Plautus, and Terence in chronological order, offering just a few thoughts about each. My hope is that any answer we discover from this quick survey of New Comedy will have some relevance to how we conduct ourselves as 21st century classicists living in a world preoccupied with clashes, crises, and the coronavirus. I'd first like to consider a subtle technique that Menander uses to help the spectators get to know a character, or just as often to fool them into thinking that they understand a character, when in fact there is much more to that character lurking beneath the surface. In Menander's comedy entitled The Shield, Aspis, the person who first arrives on stage is a veteran slave named Daos, carrying the shield of his master Cleostratos, who is wrongly presumed to have been killed in battle, and who at the end of the play will return unexpectedly alive. Or at least he would have returned had the last half of the play not been lost sometime between 300 BCE and today. In his opening speech, Daos apostrophizes his absent master, lamenting the ruin of Cleostratus's plans to spend the rest of his days in some tiny, illustrious career, and of Daos's own plans to enjoy some tina relaxation after the labors he has performed as the tutor, the paidagogos of Cleostratus. He concludes by praising the gallantry of his master, saying, "For you were a magnanimous man, if anyone, tis, ever was." In the space of 18 short lines, Daos has already used forms of tis 3 times. His fondness for indefinites, I am using the term to cover both indefinite adjectives and indefinite pronouns, becomes even more apparent in the next scene, where he assumes the role typical of a messenger in Greek tragedy, as he delivers a detailed report of the military campaign in which he and Cleostratus had recently participated, he modifies nearly every noun he can with a form of tis. Some river, potamos tis. Some deserters, automolon tinon. For some days, tinas hemeras. A certain guest friend, to xeno. A certain hill, lophon tina. A certain little hill, ti lophidion. You get the idea. He uses proper nouns as sparingly as possible, only to identify the region, Lycia, the main river, Xanthos, and the nearby island, Rhodes. The picture that Daos paints of the scene is so in-your-face indefinite that one can't help wonder what Menander intended to convey by having the paidagogos keep emphasizing that he is not being specific and not providing a name. This pattern of speech remains characteristic of Daos throughout what is left of the play. He uses a considerably higher percentage of indefinites than any of the other characters. Is it possible that this was a foreign mannerism, a tip-off to everyone that Daos was from Phrygia and not a native Athenian? Or could this style of speaking have suggested to the other characters and to Menander's audience that Daos was scrupulously honest, with each form of tis being an admission that he did not know the name, but felt obligated to note that he did not? This might have been a way for a slave to demonstrate that he was dutiful and could be trusted. If so, it is ironic that Daos turns out to be adept at inventing tricks and deceiving other characters. Or perhaps it sounded intellectual and sophisticated to qualify everything that one said with forms of tis. Later in the play, we do get confirmation that Daos has been well educated, for as part of a ruse, he quotes one verse after another from 5th century BCE tragedies that by then had become classics in the curriculum. Or perhaps Menander is simply enhancing the humor of the play by giving Daos an endearing linguistic tick that becomes all the more amusing to the spectators the more they hear it, ensuring that they will never forget the Daos who was so indefinite. After raising these various possibilities, I regret to tell you that I have come up with no definitive way to prove which of any of the explanations is correct. But it seems likely to me that an abundance of indefinites in a character's speech, or to put it differently, a penchant for calling attention to the fact that one is not naming something or not being explicit, can be just as much an individualizing trait as a character's unusual syntax or exotic word choice. There is some corroborative evidence from Menander's other extant plays. Like Daos, for example, the cook Sikon in Dyskolos is smitten with the word tis, as is the charcoal burner Soriskos in Epitrepontes. It may be significant that all three of these characters are confident about their rhetorical skills. I suspect that my students would try to persuade me that there is no rhyme or reason for how indefinite a character's speech is. They would find it easy to imagine Menander tossing in forms of tis at random, wherever each one could fit, just because he was desperate for short syllables to complete his iambic trimeters. I have to confess that I have done this myself when composing Greek verse. But I cannot believe that a writer as elegant and concise as Menander would ever have had to resort to using tinny merely to fill a line. I am much more inclined to agree with Plutarch, who comments on how well Menander has tailored his diction to suit each of his characters. When it comes to the naming of characters in New Comedy, my students back in January were quite upset that in Plautus's Menechmi, neither Menechmus's wife nor his father-in-law is ever referred to or addressed by name. They thought it cruel of Plautus to reduce each of these characters to a noun that denotes a familial role, uxor, or matrona for the wife, senex, or pater for the father. Of course, these were the same students who had great difficulty remembering the name Pyrgo Polynikes and Misargirides and many other tongue twisters coined by Plautus. Having had the opportunity to play the old man in a student production of Menechmi nearly 50 years ago, and having now attained the advanced age of a senex myself, I feel as if I have acquired some insight into the psyche of this nameless character. So I told my students that I thought it might actually be merciful and considerate of a comic playwright not to concoct a name for the father or his daughter, particularly if the concocted name would have been a witty bilingual Greek-Latin pun, amusingly inappropriate for that particular character, or perhaps fitting for the character, but in an embarrassing way. Who would want to be remembered for 2,200 years as the butt of a polysyllabic linguistic joke? My students were stubborn. They remained unconvinced. This necessitated my playing for them the video of one of our previous St. Olaf productions of Menechmi, performed in a mixture of English and Latin. What the class discovered is that when the comedy comes to life on the stage, the wife and the old man are probably the most lovable and memorable characters in the play. And it is their very lack of names that enables them to perform two services for the playwright. Not only do they keep the twin brothers Menechmi from discovering each other too early, before all the humor of mistaken identity can be squeezed out of the plot, but also, less obviously, they provide the key to the success of some of the play's funniest scenes. The truth is that to have your own individual name, far from making you a more respected or more fully fledged character, can actually, in a comedy, be a liability. It can connote that you are an object of scorn, two-dimensional, even a caricature. Having a name can thus be a theatrical, cultural, and/or linguistic barrier to winning the audience's sympathy. Not having a name, on the other hand, makes you stand out in the fictive world of the play as the closest thing to a real person, someone with whom the audience can relate. I think this is why my students, after watching the video, all chose as their favorite scene the one featuring those two unnamed characters, the senex and the uxor. When the father arrives, expecting to mediate between his daughter and son-in-law in yet another one of their domestic quarrels, the situational humor can be grasped by anyone. No names are needed. Admittedly, we do hear a character's name spoken in this scene, but that name, Menechmus, proves to be a snare and a delusion. While the name is technically correct, the person possessing it is the wrong Menaechmus. Let me mention, for those of you interested in staging Plautus, that it can work well to expand the roles of unnamed characters. So far, I have focused on the Senex and Uxor, but the Menaechmi includes two other major characters without names: the doctor, Medicus, and the courtesan's maid, Ancilla. For the production that my students watched in January, we had created a second nameless maid to accompany the nameless wife and be her sidekick. In the scene that the students liked so much, the Ancilla would repeat or reinforce the wife's comments. The pleasing balance of two women and two men was effective for blocking. And since the animal theme that we had dreamed up that year was marsupials, the doubling of the maids allowed us to double the fun. In addition to a running gag with possum, no, possum, we introduced another humorous motif with constant confusion between the words Ancilla and Ankoala. Everyone who saw the play remembered that terrible pun, making it possible for us to say that we had done our small bit to raise the profile of an unnamed character, the maid, whose contribution might otherwise have been overlooked. In case you are curious, we did keep the prologue speaker nameless, but we opted to have her wear a kangaroo costume, making her unforgettable too. I have come finally to Terence, who will lead me to some concluding remarks. I'm afraid they may be less amusing than my previous paragraphs, but I hope still worth your hearing. Thinking back once again to that ancient comedy course in January, I remember being surprised by something I had not anticipated. My Minnesota nice students found it easy to forgive Terence for writing plays with plots involving rape, enslavement, and exposure of babies. The students could see value in addressing those disturbing topics through the medium of theater. Yet they found it impossible to pardon Terence for having given so many of his characters the same name. By the end of the course, we were filling the whiteboards with complex diagrams and family trees in order to distinguish one Damea and one Parmeno and one Cyrus and one Bacchus from another. Rather than putting the blame on Menander and Apollodorus Charistius, the authors of the Greek originals that Terence adapted, my students blamed Terence for not having taken the initiative to invent more distinctive names for his characters. I suggested that using names already associated with particular character types is economical and gives Terence the freedom to play with audience expectations and develop his characters in ways that may shatter the stereotypes suggested by the names, as well as by the masks that the actors wore. My students retorted, "Even so, it is still insulting for courtesans to have to share a name and be branded as Bacchus. That is worse than having no name at all." But what outraged my students the most was something Terence did in the play entitled Hesserat, the mother-in-law. He allowed the young wife to have a name, Philumena, or Philumene if you prefer the Greek version, but then kept her completely invisible, with no lines to say, apart from an offstage shriek as she is giving birth. The students argued that since Philumena's relationship with her husband is the basis for all the misunderstandings between the two sets of in-laws in the play, she deserved a chance to be seen and to speak. Playing devil's advocate, I suggested that seeing and hearing Philumena might have made it too easy for the audience to know what to think about her. That Terence may have had an ulterior motive for depriving the spectators of the chance to meet her directly and in person. He may have wanted to demonstrate to them how difficult it is to form an accurate judgment about a character who is known to them only by her name and by what other characters say about her. I asked whether this was not one of the dangers posed by social media today. My students replied, yes, but it is still not fair for Terence to silence Philumena. She has the right to speak for herself and to be more than just a name. I am realizing only now, as I reach my peroration, that new comedy offers no answer at all to the question, to name or not to name. Instead, it just raises more questions. But they are important questions that we ought to ask one another as we reflect on where we have come from, where we are, and where we are headed. It was Birmingham, the original site for this year's CAMWS meeting, and a visit that I made to the Civil Rights Institute there that gave me the inspiration for this talk. The museum brought home to me how deeply meaningful and empowering the naming process can be for people whose names, until recently, have been left out of the historical record. Names do matter, and the naming being done in Birmingham today is the sort for which we should all be advocates. Yet, somewhere in the background, I can still hear the voices of my ancient comedy students challenging me and asking me not just their very old questions, but some very new ones too. Is merely naming people enough? Don't names run the risk of being superficial without some understanding of the human beings to whom they belong? And what about people who would prefer to be nameless, who have names they would rather not have someone announce from a public stage? Are there circumstances that would make it wise to leave certain persons and certain things unnamed and indefinite? Would it be best for us as classicists to model ourselves after wily Odysseus and call ourselves Ootis, nobody, to escape the modern day equivalent of the cave of the Cyclops? Or would it be better for us, like the writers of new comedy, to proclaim our names and invite the spectators to clap for our shows? Luckily for you, my students and I have at last run out of questions, as well as time. While a dramatic production cannot take place without its actors, it also cannot take place without a faithful crew operating behind the scenes. During these closing ceremonies, we have honored many CAMWS members by name, but CAMWS could not function, could not even exist, without all of you whose names were not read today. My thanks to every one of you. Think how much good we can accomplish if we keep our spirits up, support one another generously, and work together in peace and harmony to promote classical studies, not just in CAMWS territory, but around the globe. I can imagine no happier ending for our play. Valete omnes.